Welcome to The Critique.
Hello.
This week, we're looking at a deep theological lecture. It argues that over time, the Prophet Muhammad has been sort of fragmented into three different archetypes.
Right, you've got the traditionalist version, the Sufi version, and then the true unified example from the Quran.
And the core thesis here, this three Muhammads idea, is just incredibly potent, analytically, a really strong foundation.
It really is.
And the solution proposed is just as strong, this synthesis of spiritual life, intellectual rigor, and then physical action.
So our goal today is just to help structure this material so that powerful idea lands with, maximum force.
Exactly. Let's get right into it.
Okay. First point, it's all about the opening. The immediate provocative force of the three Muhammads thesis is significantly dulled by an overly extended opening rhetorical preamble.
Right. So when we looked at the transcript, the speaker spends, several minutes on introductory rhetoric.
A lot of time.
Yeah, there's praise for God with a whole list of attributes. Then that beautiful Saudi Gulistan story.
The soil smelling of the rose.
Exactly. And then some self-deprecating remarks. All of this happens before we even hear what the lecture is about.
And look, that spiritual lead-in, that poetic stuff, it absolutely sets a reverent tone, which is necessary. But for the listener, it acts like an intellectual roadblock.
A roadblock, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, because the intended audience for a thesis this smart is an expert listener. They're ready to engage with the argument, and we're kind of losing them in the preamble when we should be hooking them with the idea.
So the suggestion here is to basically re-engineer the opening. Prioritize the intellectual hook.
Yes, absolutely. You take those poetic, worshipful elements and you integrate them after you've established the provocative thesis.
I see. So you ground the argument in its spiritual depth later on.
You let the spiritual feeling reinforce the thesis, not, precede it by 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay, but let me push back on that a bit. How do we do that without sacrificing the reverence? I mean, isn't there a risk that if you strip away all that spiritual preamble, you alienate a big part of the devotional audience you're trying to reach?
That's a fair question, a necessary one. But we're not saying remove it, we're saying condense it.
Condense it how?
For instance, you could take all that extensive praise and focus it into a single, powerful introductory prayer. You keep the reverence, but you get to the intellectual core immediately.
So you're saying state the three Muhammads framework, traditionalist, Sufi, Quranic-like, right away.
Within the first 30 seconds. Hook the listener instantly.
Okay, so then that beautiful imagery, the Saudi story, it's not just introductory fluff. You use it later is analytical reinforcement.
Exactly. That's it precisely. Think about it. That story, I took a handful of earth, but it was perfumed by the rose.
Yeah.
Don't waste that up front. Use it as a powerful transition later in the lecture. Maybe when you're introducing the Aswahasana, the beautiful example.
Elevates our mundane humanity. How being close to that perfect example elevates the, quote, soil of our daily lives.
Yes. And just like that, the poetry becomes a structural tool.
It's serving the argument.
Not the other way around. It maximizes the impact.
Fascinating. Okay, let's move on. Our second critique gets into how the material handles that second archetype, the mystical one.
Right. To maintain logical consistency and avoid easy dismissal, the critique of the mystical archetype needs to shift its focus from sensational periphery claims to the core structural flaw of fetishism and objectification.
Okay, so as I read it, the lecture's biggest criticism of that second Muhammad, the Sufi-influenced one that's all about feeling and objects or eshya, it seems to rely on claims that a skeptical listener could just dismiss as, extreme.
Exactly. The speaker brings up examples like the prophet having the sexual power of 40 men, or boiling the entire hijrat down to just the snake story in the cave, instead of the massive political movement it actually was.
And the speaker's goal is good, right? They're trying to show how this archetype turns the prophet into an angel, not a human example you can actually follow.
The goal is admirable, yes. But using these extreme, often kind of physical, sensational examples, it risks the argument's credibility.
It feels like it's choosing the easiest targets to shoot down.
It is.
which lets the audience just ignore the much bigger, more serious intellectual point being made.
Right. So instead, we suggest grounding that critique of, let's call it misplaced devotion, more firmly in the speaker's own very powerful concept of fetishism.
So focus on how active emulation gets replaced by this passive reverence for objects and for stories that are detached from any real action.
Which the speaker actually defines as the problem later on. It's a much more robust intellectual position to take.
Yeah, it shifts the debate from, weird physical attributes to a discussion about devotional strategy.
And the structure of the lecture should reflect that right away. You should lead the critique of the Sufi archetype by emphasizing the core principle. The example must be of our own kind to be emulatable.
Mm-hmm.
And then you immediately connect that idea of shared humanity to the concept of fetishism, rather than starting with all the sensational stuff. If the goal is to avoid the prophet becoming an angel, the focus has to be on his humanity as an active role model.
And for the examples, you then prioritize the speaker's stronger points from later in the lecture.
Absolutely.
The most powerful criticism for me was when the speaker talked about turning the prophet into an antique chest.
A museum piece.
Yes, a museum piece for reverence, not emulation. You focus on the contrast between, say, crying at a relic viewing,
The annual visits to the sacred beard hair.
right, versus actually studying and following the prophet's political strategy or his discipline. Those examples make the real issue so much clearer. It's active emulation versus passive veneration.
That antique chest analogy is it's a world-class insight. It defines the problem perfectly. But, I wonder if the material risks overlooking why these ideas came about in the first place.
So is there a risk that by focusing only on objectification, the argument becomes too narrow?
I think so, yeah. The lecture seems to imply that the Sufi archetype emerged just because of a wrong identification. But I wonder if the material could briefly explore if this mystical archetype was actually a reaction.
A reaction to what?
A reaction to the cold, dry legalism of the traditionalist archetype. An overemphasis on only words and law with no soul.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. So if the traditionalists were too focused on action and words, but without the spiritual depth,
The Sufi path was an overcorrection.
an attempt to find the missing heart, the kelp, that unfortunately went too far and veered into objectifying the physical.
Exactly. And just briefly exploring that tension between the two incorrect models would add so much nuance. It would make the final Quranic synthesis feel even more necessary and even stronger.
Which is a perfect segue into that integrated ideal, the Quranic prophet.
Perfect.
Okay, so this profound concluding definition of the Quranic prophet as a synthesis of heart, kalp, head, kafa, and action, or wrist, bilek, this is the intellectual peak of the whole lecture.
It really is.
It's just a beautifully concise, actionable framework for emulation.
It's masterful. And I can see where you're going with this critique. The challenge is, this powerful tripartite framework, it's sort of summarized at the very end.
After all the examples have been given.
Right. It's not used to unify and define those examples as they're being presented.
So, to structurally reinforce the balance of the Quranic ideal, we need to integrate this framework explicitly throughout the whole discussion of the Uswa Hasana.
That's the key. The last section of the lecture has these outstanding specific stories.
The introspection in the cave of Hira, the discipline of Dar al-Arqam,
The balance between spiritual concern and worldly defense. They're fantastic examples, but they don't have a unifying structural label until the very end.
So by constantly saying which aspect is at play, is this spiritual inwardness? Is this intellectual rigor? Is this physical action? In each anecdote,
The listener gets a clear, actionable blueprint for emulation in real time.
it transforms the framework from just a summarizing tool into a defining lens.
And we need concrete examples here. For instance, when describing the Hira experience, that deep introspection, that question of who am I, the speaker should explicitly frame it
As what?
as the simultaneous development of kalp, the spiritual concern, and kafa, the intellectual search for the divine. Both are happening at once.
Right. And then when you get to the rigor of the Dar al-Arqam Institute and that fierce discipline shown in training the early companions,
You frame that as the necessary translation of kalp and kafa into bilek.
into action, execution, discipline.
It shows that the inner reality must manifest outwardly in practice. It makes the audience understand that discipline is the bridge.
And we have to leverage the speaker's own brilliant analogy here, the ability to transition from weeping at night to warlord by day.
Yes, when discussing that variability, that move from intense personal piety to firm political leadership, you explicitly state that this is the ultimate manifestation of the kalp-kapha-bilic synthesis.
All three working in perfect, seamless harmony.
And when you do that, the conclusion feels earned. It's not just stated at the end.
That level of integration would make the material not just intellectually strong, but, well, structurally airtight.
Exactly. The audience isn't left to connect the dots on their own. The speaker is handing them the entire integrated blueprint for emulation.
Which brings us to the end of this critique. I mean, overall, this material is operating at a very, very high level.
Absolutely.
It's making arguments that are just vital for contemporary theological discussions.
The material is strong, no question. And that Three Muhammad's framework is genuinely revolutionary. It just needs some of these minor structural and rhetorical tweaks to make sure that concept lands with its full intellectual and emotional force.
So to recap, we covered three main areas for improvement. First, streamline the opening. Maximize the thesis's impact by stating it immediately, and then using that beautiful poetic language as a transition later on.
Second, reframe the critique of the Sufi archetype. Move it away from the sensational, physical claims and toward the much more intellectually rigorous concept of fetishism and objectivization.
And third, use that powerful heart-head-action framework, the kalp-kapha-bilic, as a consistent structural lens through the whole second half of the argument. Make sure every positive example reinforces that integrated ideal.
That's it.
We really encourage the listener to refine the structure based on this feedback. Focus on those transitions, the immediate punch of the thesis, submit the revised work back to us. We'd love to do a follow-up, maybe focusing on the final rhetorical devices or audience alignment.
We look forward to seeing the result of this important work. Until next time.
This is the brief on the three interpretations of the Prophet Muhammad. So a renowned scholar took a deep dive into this, and it's pretty fascinating. He argues that if you misunderstand the Prophet's true character, you'd kind of risk missing the point of the whole divine message. Okay, so let's get into the three main models. First, you've got the Prophet of the Hadith scholars. This version really zeroes in on his speech, a leader who's always commanding or forbidding things. The problem, people end up just imitating the talking part without the action or context behind it. Second, there's the prophet of the mystics, or the Sufis. This view can get a little sensational, painting him as the superhuman figure who's totally detached from the world, managing the universe with a wave of his hand, which makes him more like an angel you can't possibly relate to, let alone imitate. And finally, we have what's presented as the most balanced model, the prophet of the Quran. He's called the beautiful example for a reason. He's described as a living, walking scripture. He's all about integrating that quiet, internal spiritual work with very real external action in society. And he always put that tough, inner personal struggle, the Jihad al-Akbar, first. So the real takeaway is this. For an authentic faith, the prophet has to be seen as a balanced, imitatable human example, a true blend of action, emotion, and thought. Not just some theoretical voice or a distant mystical figure.